All right, welcome back to episode 5 now of your training in interactive teaching. We've covered a lot of topics so far. We had our introductory video, which we outlined our vision, our mission, our our desired outcomes at a child's world. In terms of your work with children, we emphasized a few critical things, right? Create success, create success, create success. And then we also talked about developing relationships and developing strong, loving relationships, relationships of trust. They have to be relationships of trust. Kids have to trust you, and then making sure that those relationships are growth oriented, not just nice cuddly relationships where they like to cuddle with you. That's all great. That's well and good, and that may very well be an important factor in developing that trust. But the relationship has to create growth. It's we've all heard the term growth mindset. Again, I think we used that before in another video. Well, we need to be teachers with a growth mindset, not just regarding ourselves and our own learning and our own teaching. We need to have a growth mindset for the kids that we serve, because they probably don't understand that concept, but we do. And so we are trying to promote constant and continued growth in the children that we serve, because that's the only way that they're going to be ready to be successful in school, successful socially, successful in whether it be sports, any different aspects of life. So we are creating a growth mindset and developing all kinds of skills and abilities for the children that we serve. And yeah, so that was what we talked about in the first video. Very brief summary there, and that goes along then with the expectations that we also discussed. Remember the poem that we read in video number 1, where we read the poem "The Teacher," and it was that mentioned several times throughout the poem that her expectations are above the standards of the world. So we create high expectations, but we provide plenty of opportunities. In fact, we facilitate and create opportunities for the children to reach those high standards and to meet those expectations. That's what we're all about. And so then hence the phrase that we've also used: set expectations, set expectations, set expectations, set expectations. You can never set too many expectations. You can set too many expectations at a given moment, right? You don't want to spend an hour just setting expectations. You'll lose the kids. But over the course of a week, yeah, it's hard to say that, it's hard to set too many expectations over the course of just 1 week, and especially over the course of a month. I don't think that I think I've, known a few teachers who've ever come anywhere close to actually setting as many expectations as they probably should, even though we've had lots and lots of fantastic teachers who fit this model of interactive teaching that we're describing perfectly. But there have been a few that they've actually listed out like over 100 different expectations that they have of children, given the various settings that the children may find themselves in. And so they can draw from that list based on based on what the children are doing well, based on what they aren't doing well. So they can pick and choose from that list, and it's dependent upon the activity. So depending on the activity and what the children are doing well, they have this huge list that they can choose from. So there's that's again, like that's those are teachers who spent time thinking about their expectations in of you know in every single situation of the day, and literally came up and wrote down over 100 of them. So yeah, so that when I say that you can't have too many expectations, that's kind of what I'm talking about, is that right there. And that was highly emphasized in the video of the teacher that we talked about in our first video. Our second video, then, we talked about human needs and how human needs drive all behavior. It's critical that you as a teacher understand that every single behavior that you witness is being driven by a human need. And that helps to provide a lot of compassion as we deal with all the different behaviors we deal with in children. They are trying to meet basic, universal human needs. The third video, we talked about positive reinforcement. That's a video that if you're going to go back and watch one video again and maybe multiple times, that's probably the video. We just can't emphasize that enough. Positive reinforcement is the backbone of what we do, and especially since we approach positive reinforcement from the standpoint of social reinforcers, especially social approval and social validation. And we discussed why that is by far the most effective form of positive reinforcement, how other people can sometimes get positive reinforcement wrong, and some of the dangers of going about positive reinforcement in other ways, such as sticker charts or trinkets, toys, point systems, red light, yellow light, green light, all the different systems that people use, and also delayed reinforcers as opposed to immediate reinforcers. And when you're praising a kid, that's almost always immediate. So we discussed that. That's central to what we do. You have to do that every single day. You have to do that almost every single moment of every single day. Last video, we discussed negative reinforcement, in which we defined it, but then we explained how it relates to the behaviors that you're going to be witnessing in our facility, which would be escape behaviors. We talked a lot about escape behaviors, how escape behaviors are associated with some form of feelings of discomfort, feelings of dis-ease, right? Just not feeling it, not really being happy to be in the specific situation they're in, and so they will try to escape the behavior or they'll try and escape the situation, and that if it works, then that will result in them being reinforced. That's the definition of that behavior. Then is reinforced, thus making that behavior more likely to happen again, and that's the definition of negative reinforcement. And so we highly emphasize the importance of you being aware of all of the different emotions that kids may be experiencing, because it's usually emotional. Now, it could be, right, I mean, we talked about how escape behavior can be brought on by pain, physical pain. And it could be that a kid is experiencing some sort of physical pain within our environment. And if so, obviously that needs to be addressed right away. That's a physical safety concern. But emotional pain is the more common. And that's the one that's harder to notice because, of course, it's internal. When kids get hurt, they have a tendency to say, ow, right? But when they're feeling this internal pain, that's more difficult to notice. And so we have to be very aware of that, very aware of their internal emotions, that and thus going back to the relationship that we have with them, of knowing them, of understanding them, knowing their moods, and being aware and attuned to those moods. Also being aware of every single behavior, which you have to do in order to praise as much as we want you to, as well as, again, like we said, the more you set expectations, then the more that you'll be attuned with all the different behavior that's going on, because you'll be watching to see if the kids are actually engaging in trying to meet those expectations, or if they're struggling in meeting those expectations, and that gives you a guide. So hence the importance of setting expectations again. So those are the things we've discussed so far. This video, I really want to get into discussing some of the basics of how to handle misbehavior. But first, real quick, I always say that and it never ends up being quite real quick, but it needs to be, when we talk about the behavioral science aspects of positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and then there's punishment, and then there are natural consequences that all play in to just standard behavioral science. So again, so for this behavior, for this video, real quick, we've discussed positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishment. It should be obvious what that is. It's a negative stimuli that follows a behavior. And the initial idea when behavioral science was being researched was that punishment would be an effective tool to limit or lessen undesired behaviors, right? So you have a specific behavior, and if that behavior is not the type of behavior that we want to occur, then there is a punishment, and basically the definition of punishment in behavioral science is just something unpleasant. Again, you know how we talked about yesterday, negative reinforcement is an existing unpleasant stimuli that a kid is trying to escape from. Punishment is the infliction of a negative stimuli following an undesired behavior. And the idea behind it was that it would limit that misbehavior. And when they were studying it exclusively in rats who were actually just in cages and couldn't escape, couldn't engage in escape behavior, it turned out that punishment actually worked. But in real-world settings with kids who can engage in all kinds of escape behavior, it became very obvious very fast that punishment did not work. That was one of Dr. Art's first, I think, almost revolutionary understandings is because he was, I think, I hope I have this right, he was trained in the initial behavioral science that, yeah, punishment is a helpful way to limit undesired behaviors. But then as he went into classrooms, he very quickly realized that that was not the case. There wasn't actual research at the time that showed that, but it was obvious to him. Now we have research that very clearly shows that punishment is not an effective tool at limiting negative behaviors. And we know the reason why. We discussed it last video, right? Punishment is the infliction of an unpleasant stimuli, something that the kid does not like, but instead of it just limiting their misbehavior, what are they going to do? Right? What did we talk about in the last video when someone is faced with an unpleasant stimuli? The first thing they are going to try is they are going to attempt to escape that negative stimuli. And kids get very, very good and creative in their ways of trying to escape the unpleasant stimuli that comes from punishment. And it might be something as simple as saying, you know, I don't care anymore. I just don't care. I'm not going to try anymore, because then I don't have to feel like a failure. Because feeling like a failure, that's not comfortable. You know, that's not a desirable state of mind. That's not a desirable emotion. But if I just choose not to care, well, then I don't have to feel like a failure, because if I didn't try, well, then I didn't fail. I mean, that's just a really simple version, but I mean, kids will do all sorts of things to avoid the negative emotions that come with punishment, instead of just changing their behavior, which was the initial goal, but it just doesn't work. So now there are natural consequences, and natural consequences can work. So a natural consequence would simply be, a good example would be a child is not playing nicely with another child. And so as a result, this other child no longer wants to play with the kid who wasn't playing nicely. And that's just a natural consequence, right? Like, you're not nice to somebody, they no longer want to necessarily play with you, or they may not want to be your friend. Hopefully we encourage people to support each other and care for each other and remain friends, but remaining friends and caring for each other doesn't mean that you have to play with everybody, especially if they're not playing nicely, or if they're hurting you in some way. Obviously not if they're hurting you physically, but including if they're saying mean things, if they're engaging in any type of bullying, hurting your feelings. No kid has any obligation to continue to play with another child who is doing that to them. That's a simple natural consequence, and we can let those occur, although we need to be aware of them, and we need to be able to explain to kids why. Like, be able to explain the natural consequence to children, that, hey, this is just a natural consequence. You weren't nice to this other kid, now they're no longer interested in playing with you. Now, this could be related to natural consequences, would be logical consequences. And those are things that we may uh, engage in. We may give consequences. Again, we want to avoid the word punishment because we don't ever want it to be a negative experience for the child. We want it to be as positive of an experience as it possibly can, even when you're giving consequences. Um, so imagine a child has had a fit. They have they they've kind of torn up a classroom a little bit. Maybe they've thrown things around, made a little bit of a mess, and a logical consequence is that they have to clean up their mess, right? That's not necessarily a natural consequence because it doesn't just automatically happen. A natural consequence is something that just automatically happens. It's not teacher imposed. But a logical consequence would be something that is teacher imposed, but it's teacher imposed, and there's a very clear logical a logical connection between the behavior and the consequence, and that's why we refer to it as logical consequences, because unfortunately, lots of people give very illogical consequences, and that's not that I'm not trying to use that as a pejorative against any teachers who do this, but it's just because they probably haven't been trained in how to do this properly and correctly. So if a child engages in that behavior that I just mentioned, where they have a little bit of a fit, mess up a classroom, now there's a mess to clean up. A logical consequence would be you need to clean up your mess, right? A consequence that would not be logical would be you don't get recess for the next 2 days, or I'm going to tell your mom, and she's not going to let you watch TV tonight, or you don't get dessert tonight because you had a little bit of a fit and made a mess in the classroom today. What relationship is there between the behavior and the consequence? And if the kid can't just intuitively sense the relationship between their behavior and the consequence that we're trying to impose, then they're going to view it as a punishment, and that's going to interfere with our relationship with them. It's going to create feelings of, right, unpleasantness, feelings that they don't like, and as a result, they will do it. They'll try to engage in escape behavior often. Maybe not the first time, but certainly if it happens repeatedly, they 100% will begin to engage in escape behavior, and they'll find a way to get around the consequences. So that's why consequences need to be logical consequences in which there is a very, very direct correlation between the behavior and the consequence. There are, of course, lots of different ways that logical consequences can be implemented, lots of different potential behaviors in which we may need to use logical consequences. I'm not going to go into all of that right now because I think it's important that we go into some specific misbehavior, maybe even just the misbehavior that I just gave an example of a kid throwing a little bit of a fit and tearing up a classroom. So that would likely stem from a kid becoming escalated, right? So a kid becomes emotionally escalated, and now they're engaging in a tantrum, and and through the result of that tantrum, they they end up creating some kind of mess. Maybe they throw some things. Maybe they knock some blocks over. Um, may, maybe they're mad maybe they're mad at another kid and they destroy a Lego structure that another kid was building, and now the other kid's crying. And um, there's it can be complicated. There can be a lot of moving parts, and that's why it's difficult to deal with as a teacher. Um, but either way, the point is that the kid becomes upset, escalated, and has made some sort of mess. Hopefully not too bad, although sometimes we've seen them. They they may throw everything off of a bookshelf, and it was a complete, maybe this big huge bookshelf that had lots of things on it, all in very, specific order, and this kid just throwing it off. Um, Now, first of all, when a child begins to get escalated, we want to try to notice that as early as possible so that we can prevent that tantrum. So we see a child beginning to get frustrated, and we walk over to them and we say, "Hey, it looks like you're frustrated. What is it that's frustrating you?" And they're probably going to respond in a very frustrated voice, right? They're going to say, this kid won't do this, or nobody's listening to me, I don't know, something like that. They may stomp their feet. They may yell. They may yell at you as a teacher, but that's not personal towards you. That's just them being frustrated, and they're releasing that frustration, and your job then is to try and de-escalate that, because you've noticed de-escalation, but it hasn't turned into a tantrum yet, and so you're trying to de-escalate that. And the best way to do that is to validate their emotions. That's something else we've talked about, and we talked about that in our video on positive reinforcement, of the importance of validating a child's emotions, because that is a form of positive reinforcement. Well, this is still a form of positive reinforcement, so you can positively reinforce a kid's frustration. And now it's not necessarily reinforcing the act of them getting frustrated. What it is it's reinforcing the fact that they could trust you. That's what it's reinforcing. So a kid expresses their frustration to you, and they may do it with a little bit of yelling and a little bit of stomping. And one of the worst things the teacher can do, and this might be necessary occasionally in certain situations, and because I know teachers who do this and do this effectively, say, I'm happy to speak to you as soon as you can speak in a calm voice, as soon as you're in control of yourself, and that can be effective if a child is able to get themselves under control. And if we know that they're able to get themselves under control and that they can do it somewhat quickly. But if a child does not yet have that skill, and a lot of the children that we serve do not yet possess that skill, they need our help in de-escalating themselves. They are dysregulated. They need to become re-regulated, and for most of the children we serve, that is our job, to help them to re-regulate themselves. Obviously with the intention of helping them to be able to do it themselves, because that's certainly far better. And then if they can do it themselves, and they can do it themselves consistently, that's when you might use the phrase, you know what, I will be happy to talk to you as soon as you can speak to me in a calm voice, and we can talk about this rationally. But for a young child who's not yet learned self-regulation, that is not the approach that we want to take. They may yell, they may stomp, they may accuse somebody, they may accuse you as the teacher, and the best thing you can do is validate their frustration right away. Is to say, I understand. I understand how frustrated you are. That sounds like a really frustrating situation that you're in. And so I understand. How can I help? And now, if you've already, especially if you've already been building a relationship of trust, and now they're expressing their frustration and their anger, and then you're validating that frustration or anger, that usually can de-escalate something very quickly. Not always, but on the whole, that is by far the best strategy to de-escalate a behavior. So validate their emotions. And one of the phrases we use to help remind you to do that is we use the phrase emotion first, behavior second. Because they may be engaging, they may be beginning to engage in behaviors that we would rather them not engage in. But we cannot address those behaviors until they feel heard and validated. So now once their emotions have been dealt with and they've calmed down emotionally to where they're in a de-escalated state, they're in a state of emotional regulation, that's now when we can discuss their behaviors, and we can discuss it reasonably and rationally, and often at that point, because you've now validated their emotions, now they're often very open to behavioral correction that you may give. So obviously that's the first thing, is we want to try to notice escalation, and we want to try and intervene as early as possible. Even if a child is beginning the tantrum and has started, throwing things off the shelf, to the extent that we can say, hey, obviously you're really upset right now, and are you willing to tell me what upset you? That may be enough of just enough of a little cue to snap them out of their anger, so that they don't continue the misbehavior. And there's two reasons for that. One is obviously now not everything comes off the shelf and their tantrum doesn't last as long. But the other thing, sometimes teachers think that, well, if a kid is not directly hurting another child, then I need to just stand back and let this tantrum or this emotion carry itself out, and then I'll engage. And the reason why that's not the best approach, that can be a perfectly fine approach in very minor misbehavior, like they're just not listening to you, and you're not going to be saying, hey, I need you to listen to me right now. If you don't listen to me right now, then here are the consequences. That's not helpful. You can just praise the kids who are listening to you, and chances are that the other kid who is not listening to you, they want to get praised too, and so they'll come around. So there are times when you can ignore minor misbehavior. I think we did mention that in a previous video, but major misbehavior we do not want to ignore, and we do not want it to go on very long. Not just because that there's going to be a bigger mess for the kid or for us to deal with, and not just because it's going to make our job harder, but because it's actually wiring that. Remember how we talk about neurological wiring? Well, the fact is, every behavior a child engages in is helping to wire that behavior into their brain. So the more often a kid is engaging in a positive behavior, right? The more often a kid says please and thank you and you're welcome, or you give them an instruction and they say, okay, no problem, and they just go and they comply. Those behaviors are being wired into their brain so that they're probably going to continue those behaviors, hopefully throughout the rest of their lives, unless something happens that where something else gets wired into their brain. Because here's the thing, is once something is wired into your brain, it's there forever, unfortunately. Now, we can rewire other things, and we can rewire other things that may become stronger. And so in terms of negative behavior, that negative behavior, it's wired into their brain. But we can now wire positive behavior into their brain, and we can, if we do it right, we can make that wiring for the positive response much, much stronger than the wiring for the negative response. And that's our goal. Like I said, though, like if a kid has been regulated and behaving well all their lives, and then all of a sudden something happens and they're not engaging that way, then it's probably because now they're beginning to get some negative wiring, and it's always possible that negative wiring, if it happens long enough and goes on too long, could become stronger than the positive wiring that was instilled at a younger age. And so that's why it's actually really important that teachers at every age level understand this. But we're not providing this training to teachers of every age level. We are providing this training to you guys, teachers at A Child's World. So we do not want the misbehavior to go on any longer than necessary. So to the degree that we can cut it off, kind of snap them out of it, that's what we want to do, because we do not want that behavior to wire itself any more than it already has. Because the fact that they're even engaging in this misbehavior, it's starting to wire something into their brain. We want to cut that off. And that's absolutely shown by neuroscience. There is absolutely no doubt within the understanding of neuroscience that every single behavior that any human being engages in begins to develop neurological wiring around that. And if that behavior occurs more than once, then that behavior eventually gets it actually gets myelinated. Myelinated is like it's kind of, think of it as like the way when you have electric cables running through your house, but you put the what is it? I'm not an electrician, but you don't want the cables exposed. So you have that, I don't know if it's rubber or sometimes even just tape, but you have something surrounding it, so that the wiring can operate faster at a fast enough level. Um, and that's basically what the brain is doing. That's what myelination is. Is it's it's creating a covering over the circuitry in the brain, allowing that those behaviors to occur faster and more efficiently. And that's great. I mean, that's a remarkable thing that the brain can do, and that's what we talk about when we talk about neuroplasticity, that people can learn things at every stage of life. But the brain doesn't know the difference between a positive behavior and a negative behavior, or maybe what's healthy and what's unhealthy. There are some aspects of the brain that do know that. That's higher level neuroscience. We won't get into that. But now, we do have a prefrontal cortex. We have a conscience. We have some idea of right versus wrong. But when obviously when we're mad, when we're frustrated, and when we're engaging in some sort of tantrum or bad behavior, that part of our brain is not active, and so we're acting from the emotional part of our brain, and as a result, all of that behavior will be myelinated, and we don't want that. We don't want that circuitry to become any more myelinated or wired stronger than is absolutely necessary. So we do want to try and intervene as quickly as we can. Now, what we don't want to do is we don't want to intervene by saying, hey, stop that. That's not appropriate. Because remember, we talked about emotion first, behavior second. Why is the child engaging in this misbehavior? It's because of some sort of emotional buildup. So if you do not recognize and validate that emotion, then you're not going to get through to the child. If you go straight to the misbehavior and are focused on the misbehavior, it very well could end up creating more misbehavior. It could anger the child even more, and it could escalate their tantrum. So you may very well be escalating them, even though you think you're trying to address their misbehavior by saying, hey, that's not appropriate, stop that right now, but you may be escalating their misbehavior. Again, more mature individuals who are capable of regulating their behavior and capable of controlling their behavior, yeah, you may be able to get away with saying, hey, that's not okay. Stop that. And a more mature individual can stop. I see that on athletic teams that I coach or that my sons play on. A coach can say, no, don't do that, do this. And a kid will do it. Those are kids who have developed some sort of emotional regulation. That's not the kids typically that we're serving. And so, and certainly if you ever do that and you focus on the behavior and you notice an escalation, well, now you know automatically, like, okay, that was the wrong thing to do. I need to focus on the emotion. So you focus on the emotion. Now, sometimes though, sometimes a kid is so angry and you're just not going to be able to snap them out of it. And so even though you try a few times during their tantrum to recognize and validate their emotions, it's possible it may not work. And so that tantrum does just play itself out. Kind of like what we talked about, if some teachers just our hands off and they just always let the tantrum play itself out. And we generally don't want to do that. But sometimes that's the reality of the situation. And so the tantrum plays itself out. The kid is finished with whatever it is that they're trying to do. And now our job is, once again, to engage them in their emotions. And this is where teachers, once again, will fail all the time. It might be, okay, the kid is done tantruming, so that means that they're perfectly calm, and I'm going to instantly say, well, boy, you sure created a huge mess, and you have a lot of cleaning up to do, and so and that's what you get for doing this. But that's behavior focused. There's a very good chance that you're going to re-escalate the child if you say something like that. Now maybe you're trying to be more gentle and you say something like, hey, why did you do that? But saying, why did you do that? It's a behavioral question because you're asking them about their behavior. You're asking them, why did they engage in that particular behavior? Again, that's not the most effective approach. The most effective approach, emotion first, behavior second. And I want you to absolutely, if you remember one thing from this, again, probably slightly over 50-minute video, I want you to remember the phrase emotion first, behavior second. Always address the emotions first. So, a child's done tantruming. Instead of asking them any question, even as gentle as you possibly can, you want to avoid any question about the behavior. Instead, say, you can say something like, wow, you must have been pretty mad. See, that's an emotion-focused question. And the child oftentimes will say, yeah, you bet I was mad. Of course I was mad. And okay, why were you mad? What happened to make you so upset? And they may go on a little bit of a rant about why they were so upset. And it may not even seem logical to you, but you can still validate that, yeah, I understand because I get mad sometimes too. And sometimes when I get mad, I have a difficult time controlling my behavior. And so that's really frustrating. I'm sorry that you had to go through that. And I'm not going to demonstrate the whole process because this could take 5 minutes, 10 minutes to fully work all of this out, where you're validating their emotions, focusing on their emotions, so that they feel fully emotionally validated. I'm just giving you some very brief examples for the sake of time. But as you do that, as you focus on their emotions, whatever it was that led to the misbehavior, focus on those emotions, validate those emotions. And again, another reason for emotion first, behavior second, besides the fact that it works, is because to the extent that we want to continue to build a relationship of trust with these kids, and validation always helps, well, you can't always validate a kid's behavior. You can't say, yeah, I totally understand why you just threw everything off of these shelves and why you were throwing things across the room. Yeah, I get that. I do that too. Even if you have done that, don't tell them that, and that's not going to be helpful. We don't want to validate misbehavior. Certainly, if they hurt another kid, you can't be like, yeah, I get it. I understand why you punched that other kid. That right? We certainly can't validate. There's many behaviors that we cannot validate. But guess what we can always validate? We can always validate a kid's emotion. And so that's where you start. You start with their emotion, and once they are fully emotionally de-escalated and they feel heard and understood by you, that's when you can focus, go circle back to the behavior. And you don't want it to take too long. It's not like you're waiting a day to circle back on the behavior. And now then here's another mistake that sometimes teachers make is they kind of get this process a little bit, and it's like, okay, well, I got the kid under control. They're not misbehaving anymore, and I don't want to do anything to set them off, and so I'm just not even going to talk to them about it. And so they're doing emotion first, behavior never. But that also does not help a kid to learn and understand appropriate behavior and logical consequences to misbehavior. But here's what happens, and this is really cool when you experience it, and when you fully when you go through the process and you do it right, and you really get to experience this. That you've seen this kid who's been very upset, very emotionally escalated, and then you talk to them about their emotions. You validate those emotions, and in the process, that kid, you can tell that they are de-escalating, because just the fact that they're not throwing the tantrum anymore, they may not be behaviorally escalated, but they're still emotionally escalated. Hence the reason why when you ask them what upset them, they may go on this big long rant because they're still emotionally escalated. Listen to that rant. You can validate those emotions. But then you'll see those emotions come under control. And you'll notice that. You'll notice the regulation, the emotional regulation coming back. And it's coming back as a result of this bond between you and the child, this interaction, right? Interactive teaching again. This interaction between you and the child that is helping them to bring their emotions under control. And then once that happens, and now they feel like, oh man, someone understands me. Someone actually has listened to me and gets it. Now then, you tell them, well, there's a mess here, and we need to clean that up. And oftentimes kids will be like, yeah, I get it, I know. And they'll start cleaning up. Sometimes if you're dealing with a younger child who maybe isn't quite as developed, they may look at the mess and they may be like, I can't clean up all of this. And so you may offer to help them, but they're still going to participate. And you're going to praise them for participating. That's the other thing, is now you've validated their emotions, so you've increased the level of trust. Now they're cleaning up their mess, and you're going to praise them for that because that's positive behavior. And even if you have to help them, even if you're doing 60, or maybe even if it's a younger child or a less developed older child, even if you're doing 70% of the cleanup, you're praising the 30% that they're doing. You're not going to be like, excuse me here, why am I working harder than you, right? That's not a healthy way to go about it. But if you just praise whatever it is that they are doing, any and every positive behavior that they're doing, you praise that, that's going to reinforce that behavior, and it's going to increase that behavior. So the next time, instead of you having to do 70%, now you only have to do 50% and then 30%. And it's going to get, I mean, it's going to escalate quickly. That's a positive escalation that's going to happen quickly. And actually, you're going to get to where they're not going to misbehave as often because now maybe in the middle of, maybe the first time they were in the middle of that misbehavior and you asked them a few times, hey, I can see you're really mad. You know, what is it that made you mad? Again, focusing on the emotion, not the behavior. But maybe the first time they're gone. They're not listening to you. And they don't snap out of it. You have to wait for them to kind of, for the tantrum to run its course, and then you address the emotions. But when you do that, when you go through that process afterwards, the next time, if they're escalated, it's much easier to de-escalate it sooner. And so they start to act out, and you see that, and you say, hey, dude, or, whatever, whatever it is that you call them. But, hey, what is it that made you mad? I didn't see that. I missed that. What caused you to get so frustrated? Can you tell me about it? Well, now they're much more likely to snap out of that misbehavior and that tantrum and to focus on you because you have built a stronger relationship of trust because of the way you handled the previous misbehavior, and you've also positively reinforced behavior following that misbehavior. And so that is a way that logical consequences can actually help to build and strengthen your relationship with the child. And I can't think of anything better than that, right? Because when children, or even us as adults, when we think of consequences, I think that kind of, instills a little bit of anxiety, maybe even fear in us. But when you can use these consequences as a way to enhance your relationship with a child, you've just done wonders for that child. And the amount of misbehavior that you're going to get from that child is going to go down significantly. And the amount of positive behavior you're going to get from that child is going to go up significantly. And you've now accomplished a lot. And so we're out of time, but I hope that this has been a useful video, because we really got into some of the nuts and bolts of what you're actually doing in the classroom and some of the most difficult situations you can experience and how to address them that are, again, based on science, neuroscience, behavioral science, all of it. These are scientifically validated methods. The school district should be using these same methods. Unfortunately, they aren't, but we can. And so I hope you will, and thank you for listening. And you've made it through another episode, another video of me ranting into, hopefully not ranting, but another video of me lecturing into the screen. But I hope it's been informative and enlightening to you that, yeah, there's a lot of things that we can do to help children and to help them succeed. So thank you for your attention, and goodbye for now.